Welcome to my channel, Dr. Vanessa's Pearls and Rhinestones, where we'll discuss all things animal behavior and animal welfare. First, let's go into the environment and how it affects behavior and how we can try to effectively manage it. So there are 4 parts to neurodevelopment which contribute to a pet's development of social behavior that I want to highlight. The first one is neurogenesis, the second one is synaptogenesis, the third one is myelination, and the fourth one is called neuropruning, which involves something else called competitive elimination. So to briefly describe each of these things, neurogenesis is the creation or the formation of neurons or nerve cells, which I have written here. The majority of neurogenesis occurs during development in the embryo or prenatally before the pet is born, but it is technically a lifelong process that can occur at a much lower rate into adulthood. Synaptogenesis, the second one, is the process of forming neural connections outlined in blue here between the nerve cells to allow them to communicate with each other via neurotransmitters, which, as mentioned in the earlier video, relays whether or not a gene in the receiving neuron will be expressed and subsequently whether or not the behavior that that gene codes for will actually be displayed by the pet. The majority of synaptogenesis occurs immediately after birth, though like neurogenesis, it can occur at a much lower rate into adulthood. The third process is called myelination. So myelin, which is outlined in red here on the outside of the nerve cells, are fatty layers insulating the neurons, and when present, they allow for essentially faster and more efficient transmission or communication between the nerve cells. And finally, the fourth is neural pruning, which is a process where the brain will actually remove some of those unnecessary neural connections. Related to neural pruning is competitive elimination, where neural connections will compete with each other, leading to the elimination of weaker connections and the maintenance of stronger connections. Whether or not a neural connection is considered weak or strong is based off of whether or not the animal is engaging in the behavior or the personality or the activity that the genes within it are expressed and code for. While the majority of neurogenesis and synaptogenesis occur either before birth or very soon after birth, there are 2 additional periods of neurodevelopment that I want to highlight in all of our animals postnatally. And it's because there is escalation and progression of these last 2, myelination and neural pruning, which results in the shifts that we see in our pets' behavior as they grow up, and similarly in people as they become kids, into adolescents, and into teenagers, and into adults. We see some personalities change. The first period is called the critical period of socialization or sensitization, and the second period is called social maturity, which is similar to adolescence in humans. In dogs, the critical period is between 4 to 14 weeks of age, while social maturity occurs thereafter between 6 to 36 months of age. That huge gap is dependent on the breed. And then in cats, that critical period of sensitization or socialization occurs a little bit earlier relative to dogs, so between 2 to 9 weeks of age, and social maturity subsequently occurs thereafter at 6 to 18 months of age. Again, during these ages, those neural connections that are actively being used are being maintained and myelinated for more efficient transmission. And those neural connections that aren't really being used are eventually eliminated in neural pruning. Like I said in an earlier video, the more chance you have to rehearse a certain behavior, the more you will just keep doing it. In part, thanks to your brain maintaining those neural connections that are coding for the behaviors that you are rehearsing. So let's take an example in our pets. Let's say you have a dog that inherited a gene from its parents that is associated with a fearfully aggressive temperament. That doesn't necessarily mean the dog will exhibit a fearfully aggressive temperament. It depends on whether or not the genes that code for it are expressed or silenced, particularly during these periods of neurodevelopment. Let's say that that puppy is sadly forced into an abusive environment with a mean owner during its critical period of sensitization between 4 to 14 weeks of age. This During this time, the neural connections which contain the genes coding for the fearfully aggressive temperament will likely be activated and expressed due to the puppy defensively feeling the need to rehearse fearfully aggressive behavior in the environment towards its mean owner. Now, let's say, fortunately, this person surrenders the puppy to a shelter and you subsequently adopt that puppy at around 6 months of age, that second period of neurodevelopment called social maturity. You recognize that when you adopt the puppy, that when he sees strange men, he will back away fearfully, and if the man persists on moving towards him, he will start to bark and growl. Upon some poor advice from a trainer, because the dog training world is unregulated, it is recommended that you keep exposing this dog to unfamiliar people so that the puppy learns to quote unquote behave. By being forced into these triggering environments, the neural connections that are coding for this defensively aggressive genes that the puppy inherited will become repeatedly expressed through rehearsal and via neural pruning and competitive elimination during social maturity. Those neural connections will be maintained and even become stronger. And now you have an adult dog who consistently exhibits the defensively aggressive behavior towards unfamiliar men that those genes code for, all thanks to epigenetics, i.e., the influence of the environment. Now let's create a different scenario with that same puppy. Again, he had that mean owner between 4 to 14 weeks of age. He was relinquished to a shelter, and now you adopt him at the start of social maturity around 6 months of age. And you recognize that the dog's behavior around unfamiliar men is due to fear. And so you avoid forcing him into environments that make him afraid while you consult with a veterinary behaviorist for some calming supplements or medication and a trainer with a positive reinforcement methodology. By managing this puppy's environment during social maturity, you have prevented the rehearsal of fearfully aggressive behavior and contributed to the weakening of those neural connections. Once the puppy is in a better headspace, thanks to the vet behaviorist and the trainer, he learns positive coping mechanisms so that if he's in a situation as an adult dog with that triggering unfamiliar men, he now has rehearsed the neural connections coding for positive coping mechanisms instead of the now weakened neural connections coding for the fearfully aggressive temperament. While you can't control which genes your pet has inherited, you can contribute responsibly to which of those genes are expressed or silenced through the environment's influence on epigenetics, particularly during those critical periods of neurodevelopment. And don't worry if you adopted your pet even after the critical period of socialization or social maturity. Technically, all 4 periods of neurodevelopment, neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, myelination, and neural pruning, are lifelong processes. As they say, learning is lifelong. And at the very least, with the information discussed in these videos, you can be more empathetic and understanding of your pet who may exhibit these behaviors that you perceive as a problem, because you understand that they are being expressed due to the unfortunate combination of genetics and a poorly socialized early environment the pet was put in prior to your adoption out of his control. As a disclaimer, none of the general discussions in these videos should be taken as specific recommendations to any patient or pet. A veterinarian cannot offer specific recommendations to any patient or pet with whom they do not have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship with, which requires an in-person examination in addition to a comprehensive understanding of that patient's unique history to form appropriate clinical judgment. For any questions about a specific animal, please refer to the family veterinarian with whom that animal has a valid veterinary client-patient relationship.